Good.
Got a little light on you here. And you'll look my way while we talk. Congressman, first of all, do you think people are aware that we still have troops in Syria?
I don't think most Americans even know a Syrian, much less know that we have 900 of our troops in this hellscape war zone without a clear objective, without a real authorization to be there. And I'm going to force a vote on the floor of the House of Representatives to bring home America's troops from Syria and withdraw from that battle space.
Now, have you identified the value of having American troops there? And I count it in terms of, are they advisors? Are they active combat?
A lot of what the Americans in Syria are doing today would qualify as supercharged law enforcement, where they're raiding drug dealers or street thugs who have a cousin in ISIS or some tangential connection, and then we act as though we have the ability to extinguish any thought in favor of ISIS in the heart of every single Syrian. I don't think that's a reasonable objective. Even the Inspector General for the Department of Defense says that ISIS has no ability at this point to strike the homeland, and other powers in the region, such as the Turks, the Kurds, have the ability to keep pressure on ISIS so a caliphate does not form. But America is not a Middle Eastern power. We are an Atlantic power, we are a Pacific power, and for us to be futzing around in the Middle East for 8 years in Syria seems unwise.
Now, 8 years dates back to some of the worst of the Assad regime. What was the premise of getting American troops there in the first place, and was it valid at the time?
Obama made the decision to enter the United States into the Syrian civil war. I think it was a very bad decision at the time. There was a view among the Obamaites and even neoconservative Republicans that we could build Jeffersonian democracies out of sand and blood and Arab militias in the Middle East. The truth is, when despots, bad people like Assad, Gaddafi, Saddam are toppled, often what you get in place is not a better version of governance, but a version more committed to Islamic fundamentalism and political Islam.
Why didn't Trump pull the troops out when he had the chance?
I'm grateful that President Trump had tremendous troop reductions in Syria. We ended the Trump administration with far fewer troops in Syria than we began, and that's to President Trump's great credit. I think he had a lot of neoconservatives in his administration who really wanted to keep some presence there. It's a presence that I think lacks a definable objective, and it's one that Congress ought to engage in.
So what's this resolution supposed to accomplish?
Yeah, the resolution today would require the withdrawal of the 900 troops that the United States has in Syria. It would require that withdrawal within 6 months, and it would go to the Senate if passed, and the president wouldn't have to sign it. It would have the force of law in the absence of Joe Biden's acquiescence because it is brought under the War Powers Resolution.
Okay, new topic. Your comments to CPAC about getting rid of some of the alphabet agencies, that they're long-standing, they've been around a while. You're not calling just for reform, are you?
Well, I said that we must call a lot of these entities of our government that have been weaponized to heal. And if we cannot craft authorities that are in line with our values and our belief on the Constitution, and particularly the First Amendment, then yes, I think that we ought to take a meat cleaver rather than an X-Acto knife to some of these agencies. You know, it's not just the FBI and the DOJ. I would certainly include the ATF in that list. They've been making illegal lists of gun transactions and have far exceeded the authority they've been given by Congress.
What kind of skepticism do you have that their mission creep is beyond reform, and you're actually going to have to start over?
Well, that's what we have to decide. We have to decide whether or not we can rescue some of these entities that were once vaulted, like the FBI, from political capture. So I don't want to see the FBI in a worse shape. I want to see them in a better shape, but we ought to follow the facts and the law. We ought not use federal law enforcement as the enforcement wing of either political party. And what we're seeing now from whistleblowers is that the claims of domestic violent extremism were greatly exaggerated in order to justify enforcement of political viewpoint, what people were posting online, their beliefs on the Second Amendment, immigration, things that Americans ought to be able to differ on without having federal law enforcement involved.
You know, we haven't seen much progress getting local standards and practices for law enforcement. How do you think a federal agency is going to either respond or to your challenge of some kind of assessment that says you got to fix this?
Local law enforcement has to be responsive to the needs in communities. Otherwise, sheriffs don't get elected and police commissioners get fired. Here in Washington, we've allowed the field office of the FBI to have political mission creep. Much of what I'm learning is that we have wonderful FBI agents all around the country who protect Americans every day. But right here in Washington, there seems to be a real adherence to the political left. I don't know when that happened. The FBI used to actually target people on the left, like Malcolm X, Marcus Garvey, Martin Luther King Jr. Now they're targeting people on the right. I don't think either is appropriate. I think we ought to protect our First Amendment, protect our civil liberties, and where we see a persistence in violating the law, violating regulations, we have to constrain authorities, reduce resources, or eliminate the agencies altogether.
There's an awful lot of interpretive leeway in what you just said, though. Who gets to decide?
Well, the Congress, the elected representatives of the people, should get to decide what the guardrails are on some of these federal law enforcement agencies. We are troubled when we read the Inspector General reports that show that on foreign surveillance, for example, the requirements for predicate aren't being met, the files aren't being appropriately maintained, and Americans are caught in a dragnet that would never be otherwise appropriate by our constitutional standards. That's what really concerns us about the FBI. Every time we peel back another layer of the onion, we see another need for reform, especially with the work going on in Washington.
Okay, so what's the trigger point? What point do you say we got to start over, and what point is it just reform?
Well, right now, the Weaponization Subcommittee and the House Judiciary Committee are looking at the various authorities that have been most misused. And I think our initial preference would be to target those authorities and to provide better guidance. But where there is a clear line and where the FBI folks have gone far beyond that, we have to have the humility to understand that the laws themselves do not have fiat. And so we have to cut off the bloodstream to the most corrupt things going on at the FBI, DOJ, and at other agencies, and the way to do that is to cut off the money.
Would your concerns extend to the FISA court?
Yes, I am deeply concerned about what's happening in FISA courts. I believe those courts are not publishing decisions after the fact so that we can develop a sense of jurisprudence. And I'm frustrated that FISA judges haven't wrapped some of these prosecutors on the knuckles for hiding evidence, for changing evidence. In most courts I've practiced in, if you behaved that way, the court would cite you for contempt and probably refer you to the bar to have your license revoked. Here, there seems to be a greater tolerance for some of the mischief that's concerning a lot of Americans.
In some cases, the FISA judges have been accused of just taking the word for it when it comes to the presentation for a secret warrant, perhaps. But it is a one-sided system.
Yeah.
Do you see making it two sides so somebody can push back on these allegations or intent?
It is always an extra challenge when we don't have an adversarial system in our jurisprudence because you have a judge hearing only one side of the argument. We have looked at some reforms that would make that an adversarial process, that would create an ombudsman to go and present arguments that would force prosecutors to make their case. That might be one reform, but the abuses in FISA run so deep that I don't know that it's truly savable in its current form. We may have to start with a blank sheet of paper with FISA authorities.
Well, that's my analogy to the agencies that you've got in your sites too. Where do you take their word for it that they're going to adhere to standards and practices versus outside oversight that they're liable to resist?
Well, we've seen the FBI and the Department of Justice recalcitrant to the oversight that we've already begun. My colleagues and I have sent countless letters seeking information about the law enforcement utility, for example, of targeting parents at school board meetings, and we're very unsatisfied with the responses that we've been getting. And so the power of the subpoena is only significant if it manifests in action on the power of the purse. Because us just dragging these few people before our committees and browbeating them doesn't lead to change when they go right back to the J. Edgar Hoover building and start violating the civil liberties of our fellow Americans. So that's really what's different, I think, about how we view the process in 2023 and even how I viewed some of the bad actions of the FBI in 2017 and 2018 when I first got to Congress. Now, we really see the importance of lashing oversight to the funding requests that are made by these agencies. And in the past, we've been unsuccessful at ripening that fight about funding because the way we've been funding the government almost the whole time I've been here is through one vote on some multi-thousand-page bill that funds everything at once. Because of the concessions that we received during the speaker election, we now have to evaluate these agencies in these areas independently, and I think that individualized scrutiny will allow us to use the work product from our oversight to make more rational funding decisions.
Last question is that evaluation process. Is that what we should be on the lookout for as far as your next step is concerned?
We are taking weekly depositions. We have sent out from the Judiciary Committee the most number of subpoenas in the Congress thus far, and I expect that velocity to increase substantially. And here's what the American people should watch. When we send subpoenas to people who are currently at the FBI and DOJ, do they honor them? Do they come in, or do they resist? And if they resist, what does that tell us about the seriousness with which the Biden administration takes congressional oversight? We take it seriously, and if they don't, they're not going to get a blank check to continue to weaponize this government against our citizens.
Congressman, thanks for stopping by.
Thank you.